Parents were furious that I wasted their time, and my sisters mocked me. One sister overdosed. Father walked away, and the other sister. Hey Reddit, I don't usually post about my life, but I've been carrying this weight around for so long, I feel like I might explode if I don't let it out somewhere. I guess I just need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone out there will understand. I am the oldest of 3 kids in what most people would call an average middle-class family. My parents, John and Margaret, are good people, I guess. They worked hard, put food on the table, and tried to give us a decent life. But somewhere along the way, something went wrong. Or maybe it was always wrong, and I just didn't notice until it was too late. I have 2 younger sisters, Emily and Sarah. They are twins, and to say they are the golden children of the family would be an understatement. From as far back as I can remember, everything revolved around them. It wasn't just the usual, they were younger, so they need more attention kind of thing. No, this was different. My parents doted on them, showered them with gifts, praise, and affection while I was just there. I remember one time, I came home from school with a report card full of A's. I was so proud of myself, and I thought maybe, just maybe, my parents would notice me for once. But when I showed it to them, my dad barely glanced at it before he turned to Emily and Sarah and asked them about their day. They had gotten some new jewelry, matching necklaces or something, and my mom couldn't stop gushing over how beautiful they looked. I stood there, holding my report card, feeling like the invisible man. That is how it always was. Birthdays, holidays, even just regular days, everything was about Emily and Sarah. They were smart, beautiful, popular, and my parents never missed an opportunity to remind me of that. And don't get me wrong, I love my sisters. But it's hard to love someone when you're constantly reminded that you're not as good as them, that you'll never be as good as them. School wasn't any better. I was quiet, kept to myself mostly. I wasn't bullied in the classic sense, not at first anyway. But I was overlooked, just like at home. Teachers didn't call on me. Classmates didn't notice me. I was just another face in the crowd, easily forgotten. It didn't help that Emily and Sarah were at the same school. They were the popular ones, the ones everyone knew and liked. I was Emily and Sarah's brother, and that was the extent of my identity. Then came high school, and things took a turn for the worse. The few friends I had drifted away, caught up in their own lives, and I was left alone, completely alone. The bullies noticed, of course, they always do. They started picking on me, calling me ghost because I was so quiet, so easy to miss. They'd shove me into lockers, trip me in the hallways, steal my lunch money. And the worst part? No one did anything. No one even seemed to see it happening. Not the teachers, not the other students, not even my own sisters, who walked those same halls every day. By the time graduation rolled around, I was just tired. Tired of trying, tired of hoping things would change. I barely even cared when my dad told me I wouldn't be going to college. "You're done with school, Luke," he said, as if it was a given. "It's time to start earning your keep. I got you a job at the factory." I didn't argue. What would have been the point? Emily and Sarah were off to college, to bigger and better things, while I was stuck in the same place, doing the same thing, day after day. The factory job was, it was what you'd expect. Hard, dirty work with long hours and little pay. The guys I worked with were rough, but they left me alone for the most part. I think they could tell I wasn't looking to make friends. I just wanted to get through the day, go home, and repeat the cycle. I used to have dreams, you know? I wanted to go to college, maybe become a writer or a teacher. I liked the idea of making a difference, of being someone who was noticed, who mattered. But those dreams died a long time ago, buried under the weight of reality. Now I don't know what I want. I don't know if I want anything at all. I don't know why I'm telling you all this, Reddit. Maybe I just need to know that someone out there sees me, that I am not invisible. Maybe I'm hoping that if I scream into the void loud enough, someone will scream back. Anyway, that's my life. Not much to it, really. Just the shadow of a family that never really saw me. Update. Hey Reddit. I am back. I didn't really expect to write more, but there's something almost comforting about this, sharing my story with strangers who might actually care. Or maybe it's just easier to talk to people who don't know me. Anyway, here is more of what I've been dealing with. After high school, life became this monotonous cycle. I'd wake up, go to the factory, come home, eat dinner in silence while my parents talked about my sisters, and then repeat. Day after day, week after week. It was like I was stuck on this endless loop, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find a way out. Emily and Sarah were off at college, living the lives my parents had always dreamed of for them. From what I heard, which wasn't much, considering no one really bothered to tell me, they were popular there too. Always the center of attention, always surrounded by friends. They were living the life I used to dream about, back when I still had dreams. And me? I was just existing. I stopped trying to connect with my parents. What was the point? They barely noticed I was there anyway. The only time they acknowledged me was when something needed to be done, fixing something around the house, running errands, that sort of thing. I became the family's handyman, the one who kept things running in the background while everyone else lived their lives. It wasn't long before I started noticing something about my sisters. At first, it was just small things, snippets of conversation I overheard when they'd call home, the way they'd avoid talking about school whenever they came back for the holidays. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe they were just busy, or maybe they didn't want to rub it in that they were living their best lives while I was stuck in the same place. But then things started to get worse. They'd come home for breaks looking different. Not just physically, though they did look more tired, more worn out. No, it was something else. Something in their eyes. The spark that had always been there, the one that made them the golden children, the ones everyone adored, was fading. It all came to a head one night during a family dinner. I was sitting at the table, pushing food around on my plate, while my parents tried to pry information out of Emily and Sarah about their classes, their friends, their futures. But the twins were evasive, giving short, vague answers that didn't satisfy anyone. Finally, my dad snapped. "What's going on with you two? You're not the same. You're wasting your potential, and for what? Parties? Boys?" I watched as Emily and Sarah exchanged a look, and for the first time I saw fear in their eyes. Real, genuine fear. And then Sarah, always the braver of the two, spoke up. "Dad, we've made some mistakes." My mom gasped, and my dad's face turned red with anger. "What kind of mistakes?" he demanded. Sarah hesitated, and then Emily jumped in, her voice trembling. "We got involved with the wrong crowd. We've been partying a lot. Drinking, drugs, it got out of hand." The silence that followed was suffocating. My parents just stared at them, their faces a mix of shock, disappointment, and anger. And all I could do was sit there, watching it unfold, feeling like I was witnessing the beginning of the end. "I'm sorry," Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We never meant for it to get this bad." For a moment, I thought my parents might forgive them, might try to help them. But then my dad's face hardened, and he stood up from the table. "You two have thrown away everything we worked so hard to give you," he said coldly. "You've ruined your futures." My mom didn't say anything, just sat there with tears in her eyes, looking like her whole world was falling apart. And in a way, I guess it was. After that night, things changed. My parents became distant, almost like they were in shock. They didn't know how to handle the fact that their perfect daughters weren't so perfect after all. And Emily and Sarah, they spiraled even further. They stopped coming home as much, and when they did, they barely spoke to anyone. I could tell they were struggling, that they were trapped in their own cycles of guilt and self-destruction. But I didn't know how to help them. I didn't even know if I should. It was a weird feeling seeing them like that. Part of me wanted to reach out, to be the brother they needed. But another part of me felt like this was just karma. Like maybe they were finally getting a taste of what it was like to be invisible, to be overlooked, to be the one who didn't matter. But I couldn't let myself think like that. I couldn't let myself become that bitter. So I just kept my head down, kept going to work, kept living my quiet, lonely life. I thought things couldn't get worse, but I was wrong. I was so wrong. Update 2. Hey Reddit. I wish I could say things got better after that, but life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it, and not always in a good way. So things were pretty tense at home after my sister's big confession. My parents didn't know how to deal with the fact that their golden girls had fallen from grace, and Emily and Sarah seemed lost, like they didn't know how to pick up the pieces of their lives. I kept my distance, figuring it was better to let them work it out on their own. After all, they never needed me before, right? But then one night, everything changed. I was working a late shift at the factory. It wasn't too unusual. I took whatever shifts I could get, mostly to avoid being at home. The guys at the factory weren't exactly friendly, but they were better company than my parents' silent disappointment. I was in the middle of my usual routine, just trying to get through the night, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a call from my mom. That alone was strange. She never called me, especially not when I was at work. I hesitated for a second before answering, my gut telling me something was wrong. Luke, my mom's voice was shaky, barely holding it together. Luke, it's Emily. She's in the hospital. It's bad. I froze, my mind struggling to process her words. Emily? The sister who had always been so full of life, who everyone adored, who seemed untouchable. It didn't make sense. What happened? I managed to ask, my voice sounding distant, like it belonged to someone else. She overdosed, my mom whispered, and I could hear the tears in her voice. They were saying she might not make it. I don't even remember the rest of the conversation. I just know that somehow I ended up at the hospital, standing in front of a room where my sister lay hooked up to a bunch of machines. My parents were already there, my mom sobbing quietly into a tissue, while my dad stood rigid, his face pale and drawn. And then there was Sarah, sitting in a chair by Emily's bed, looking like a ghost of herself. I stood there for what felt like hours, just staring at Emily, trying to reconcile the person lying in that bed with the sister I'd grown up with. The one who had always been so vibrant, so alive. Now she was pale, her skin almost translucent under the harsh hospital lights, her chest rising and falling with the help of a machine. It didn't seem real. None of it did. At some point, a doctor came in and started talking to my parents, but I didn't really hear what he was saying. I was too focused on Emily, on the rise and fall of her chest, on the way her fingers twitched every now and then, as if she was trying to fight her way back to us. But she didn't. The hours ticked by, and she didn't wake up. The doctor's words finally started to penetrate the fog in my brain. Critical condition, severe damage, unlikely to recover. They were saying she was gone, even though her body was still there, kept alive by machines that were doing all the things her body couldn't anymore. My mom broke down, collapsing into my dad's arms, and for the first time, I saw real tears in his eyes. He didn't cry when I was born, didn't cry when anything happened to me, but here he was, falling apart over Emily. And then there was Sarah. She hadn't moved from her spot by the bed, hadn't said a word, just sat there, staring at Emily like she was waiting for her to wake up. I couldn't take it. I couldn't stand the sight of my family falling apart, of my sister lying there, practically dead, while the rest of us just waited. So I left. I walked out of the hospital, out into the cold night air, and I just kept walking. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't be there anymore. I wandered the streets for hours, my mind spinning, trying to make sense of everything. How had we gotten here? How had things gone so wrong? And why did it feel like it was all my fault? Like maybe if I'd done something differently, none of this would have happened. I ended up back at the factory, sitting on the curb outside, my hands shaking as I tried to light a cigarette. I hadn't smoked in years, but in that moment, I didn't care. I just needed something to calm my nerves, to distract me from the chaos in my head. When my phone rang again. It was Sarah this time. I almost didn't answer, but something in me knew I had to. Luke, she said, her voice flat, empty. She's gone. Emily is gone. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? I just sat there staring at the ground. Sarah didn't say anything else, just hung up, leaving me alone in the dark with the news that my sister was dead. I stayed there for a long time, just sitting in the cold, trying to process what had happened. I knew I should go back to the hospital, be there for my parents, for Sarah, but I couldn't eat. I just couldn't eat. So I stayed where I was, alone in the dark. Update 3. Hey Reddit, I am back, but this time I don't even know where to begin. If you've been following my posts, you know things were bad. But after that night, after Emily, I don't even recognize my life anymore. Everything just spiraled out of control. After I got that call from Sarah, telling me Emily was gone, I stayed at the factory for hours, smoking through an entire pack of cigarettes. I don't know what I was waiting for, maybe for the sun to come up, maybe for some kind of sign that it was time to go back to my family. But no sign came, and by the time I finally made it home, it was almost morning. The house was eerily quiet when I walked in. My parents were in their room, the door closed. I could hear my mom crying softly through the walls, but I didn't go to her. I didn't know how. Sarah was sitting on the couch in the living room, staring blankly at the TV, which was playing some late-night infomercial. She looked up when I walked in, but her eyes were empty, hollow. "She's really gone," she said, her voice flat. It wasn't a question, just a statement of fact, as if she was still trying to convince herself it was true. "Yeah," I replied, my own voice sounding foreign to my ears. "She's gone." The next few days were a blur. There was the funeral to plan, relatives to call, arrangements to make. My parents went through the motions like they were on autopilot, barely acknowledging me or Sarah, barely acknowledging each other. The house was filled with people, family, friends, neighbors offering their condolences, bringing food, trying to be supportive. But all I wanted was for them to leave. I wanted to be alone, to grieve in peace, but that wasn't an option. Not in a family like mine, where appearances were everything. Watching my parents break down as they lowered Emily's coffin into the ground, knowing there was nothing I could do to fix it, it was unbearable. And Sarah, she was just a shell of herself. She barely spoke to anyone, just stood there, staring at the grave, like she was waiting for Emily to come back, like she couldn't accept that her sister was really gone. After the funeral, things got even worse. My dad, he couldn't handle it. He was always a tough guy, always the one in control, but losing Emily broke something in him. He started drinking more, lashing out at everyone around him. He'd come home from the bar, reeking of alcohol, and take his anger out on me and Sarah. He blamed us, blamed everyone but himself. My mom withdrew completely, barely leaving her room, barely eating. She just sat there, surrounded by pictures of Emily, talking to them like she was still alive. It was like she couldn't face the reality of what had happened, like she was living in some kind of denial. And Sarah, I don't even know how to describe what happened to Sarah. She started drinking too. She was in and out of the hospital after the overdose, dealing with her own injuries and the psychological aftermath. She was broken, and no one could reach her. Not me, not our parents, not anyone. She was just gone, in a different way than Emily, but gone all the same. The house that was once so full of life, so full of noise and energy, became a tomb. We were all just living in the shadows of what had happened, unable to move forward, unable to let go. I kept going to work at the factory, kept my head down, did my job, but it felt meaningless. Everything felt meaningless. One night, a few weeks after the funeral, I came home to find Sarah sitting on the front porch, a bottle of whiskey in her hand. She looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot, her face pale. "Luke," she slurred, "why didn't you save her?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't know how to respond. She just looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pain. "We were all dying, Luke," she said, her voice breaking. "Emily's gone. And now Mom and Dad, they are dying too. And me, I am already dead inside." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, but the truth was, I didn't believe it myself. So I just sat down next to her on the porch, and we drank in silence. I don't know how much longer we can keep living like this. I don't know if there's a way out, or if this is just how things are now. But I do know one thing: I can keep going on like this, pretending that everything's fine, that I am fine, because I am not. None of us are. Update 4. Hey Reddit, I've been putting off writing this next part because it's hard to talk about. But I guess that is the whole point of sharing, right? To get it out there, to stop carrying it all by yourself. So here it goes. After that night on the porch with Sarah, things went from bad. My dad's drinking escalated. He started coming home later and later, more drunk and more angry each time. He would stumble in, barely able to stand, and then the yelling would start. He'd rage about everything, about Emily, about how we'd let her die, about how Sarah was throwing her life away, about how I was a disappointment. It was like he needed someone to blame, and since Emily wasn't there, we were the next best thing. I learned to stay out of his way, to keep my head down and avoid eye contact. But Sarah, she couldn't. She would fight back, yell at him, tell him he was the one who failed us, who failed Emily. And every time, it would end the same way, with Sarah in tears, my mom locked in her room, and my dad storming out to drink even more. One night, it got really bad. I was in my room trying to drown out the sound of their arguing when I heard a crash. It was loud, like something heavy had been thrown against the wall. I rushed out of my room, my heart pounding. and found Sarah lying on the floor, a glass bottle shattered next to her. My dad was standing over her, his face twisted in anger. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" He slurred, his words barely coherent. "You think you can just throw your life away just like your sister did?" "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I couldn't just stand there and watch anymore." I stepped between them, pushing my dad back, trying to get him to calm down. "That's enough, Dad," I said, my voice shaking. "You need to stop." But he didn't stop. He just shoved me aside, knocking me into the wall. I hit my head hard enough to see stars, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to let him hurt Sarah. Not again. "Get out of the way," he growled. Something inside me snapped. All the years of neglect, of being ignored, of being the invisible son, it all came flooding out at once. I thought, where were you all these years when I needed you? He continued to stand unsteadily and look at me, staring at me like he didn't recognize me. Maybe he didn't. Maybe for the first time he was actually seeing me, really seeing me. But it didn't matter. Sarah was lying on the floor. He stepped over her and walked away. He didn't come back that night, or the next, or the next. We didn't know where he went, and honestly, we didn't care. My mom was too far gone to notice, too lost in her own grief to even realize her husband had abandoned us. And Sarah, she just withdrew further into herself, drinking more, talking less. A few days after my dad disappeared, I came home from work to find Sarah gone. There was no note, no sign of where she'd gone, just an empty bottle of pills on her bed. I found her at the hospital, unconscious but alive. They said she'd overdosed, that she was lucky to be alive. She survived, but things were never the same. She refused to talk to me, refused to talk to anyone. She was a shell of the sister I once knew, and I didn't know how to reach her. My dad never came back. My mom passed away a few months later, heart attack, they said. I wasn't surprised. She'd been dead inside for a long time. That left just me and Sarah, two broken people living in a broken house, surrounded by the ghosts of our past. I tried to be there for her, tried to help her get through it, but it was like talking to a brick wall. She was so far gone, so lost in her own pain, that I didn't know if she'd ever come back. I don't even know why I'm writing this, Reddit. Maybe I just need someone to tell me it's going to be okay, even if I don't believe it myself. Maybe I just need to know that someone out there is listening, because right now, it feels like I am screaming into the void. Who advised me what to do? I would appreciate your feedback. Update 5. Hey Reddit. I guess I am back because things just keep getting worse, and I'm starting to feel like there's no bottom to this pit I am in. After everything that happened with Sarah, I tried to focus on work. It was the only thing that made any sense anymore. It was monotonous, sure, but there was comfort in the routine. It kept my mind off everything else, at least for a little while. I got a call from the hospital. Sarah was there again. I wasn't allowed to see her for a long time. Eventually, they let me in. Sarah was lying in the bed. The doctor came in and explained that she'd overdosed again, but this time it wasn't just the pills. There was alcohol involved, and it had done a number on her liver. When the doctor finally left, I was alone with Sarah. I stayed at the hospital all night, just sitting there, waiting for something, anything. I kept hoping that maybe she'd open her eyes, that maybe we'd get a second chance to make things right. But that didn't happen. The doctor said it would take time. The next day I had to go back to work. As much as I wanted to stay by Sarah's side, I couldn't afford to lose my job. So I went to the factory, went through the motions, but I was on autopilot. I kept checking my phone, waiting for the call, dreading it, but knowing it was coming. My dad showed up at the factory. I hadn't seen him since the night he left, and honestly, I hadn't expected to see him again. But there he was, standing at the entrance, looking worse for wear, disheveled, unshaven, and reeking of booze. He spotted me right away and made a beeline for me. He muttered something. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want anything to do with him. But before I could walk away, he grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong for someone in his condition. He started yelling and swearing and accused me of everything again. Before I knew what was happening, he lunged at me, his fist connecting with my jaw. The force of the blow sent me crashing to the ground, my head slamming against the concrete floor. For a moment, everything went black. When I came to, I was lying there, dazed, with my dad standing over me, his face twisted in a mix of rage and something else, regret maybe. But I didn't care anymore. I was done. He didn't say anything. He just stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked away, stumbling out of the factory and into the night. That was the last time I saw him. I tried to focus on my work, but the headaches didn't go away. They got worse. Until one day, I collapsed at the factory. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines. The doctor told me I had a severe brain injury, something they'd missed the first time around. I was lucky to be alive, they said. So here I am, Reddit, lying in a hospital bed, my sister barely hanging on in another room, my dad gone, my mom dead. I've lost everything, and I don't know if I can keep going. I don't even know if I want to. Final update. Hey Reddit, I've been putting off writing this next part because, honestly, it's the hardest thing I've ever had to talk about, but I guess I'm already in too deep to stop now. So here it is, the final piece of the story. After I collapsed at the factory, I spent what felt like an eternity in the hospital. The doctors were concerned about my brain injury, and they ran every test under the sun, trying to figure out just how much damage had been done. The news wasn't too good. They told me I'd need surgery, that the injury was worse than they'd thought, and if they didn't operate soon, things could get even worse. I agreed to the surgery because honestly, what choice did I have? I was barely holding it together as it was. The day of the surgery, I was lying in the hospital bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying not to think about what could go wrong. My mind kept drifting to Sarah, still in her own hospital room, still unconscious. I hadn't been able to see her since I was admitted, and the guilt of that weighed on me. I should have been there for her, but instead, I was the one who needed help. Just before they wheeled me into the operating room, a nurse came in and told me I had a visitor. I was surprised who would come to see me. My dad was gone, my mom was dead, and Sarah wasn't in any shape to visit anyone. But when the nurse stepped aside, there she was, Sarah. She looked frail, like she was barely hanging on, but she was awake. She was actually awake. The nurse helped her into a chair next to my bed, and for a moment we just stared at each other, neither of us knowing what to say. "Luke," she finally whispered, her voice raspy and weak. "I am sorry." The nurse came back in then, telling me it was time to go. "I'll see you after," I promised, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince her or myself. They wheeled me into the operating room, and the last thing I saw before the anesthesia took hold was Sarah's face. When I woke up, I was disoriented, groggy, but the first thing I did was reach for my head. There was a bandage there, and I felt a sharp pain where the surgery had been done. But I was alive. I was still here. The doctors said the surgery went well, that I'd need time to recover, but they were optimistic. It took a few days before I was well enough to visit Sister. When I finally made it to her room, I found her sitting up in bed, looking better than she had in weeks. After I was discharged from the hospital, I moved back home. The house was still filled with ghosts, but it didn't feel as suffocating as it had before. Sarah came home a few weeks later. Sarah seemed determined to get better, to move on from everything that had happened. She went to her therapy sessions, took her medication, and even started talking about going back to school someday. It started with little things: Sarah withdrawing again, spending more and more time alone in her room, not talking as much. She said she was just tired, that she needed space to process everything. I believed her because I wanted to believe her. Then one night, I came home late from work. I pushed the door open, and at first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the moonlight streaming in through the window. And there, in the center of the room, was Sarah hanging from the ceiling fan by a makeshift noose she'd fashioned from an old bedsheet. Her face was pale and her lips were blue. Her eyes were open, but there was no peace in their expression. She looked like she was in a lot of pain, like she was suffering to the very end. And then I saw the scars on her wrists, fresh cuts, deep and angry. Blood was running down her arms, staining the sheets on which she had committed suicide. It was obvious that she had tried to bleed to death before hanging herself, as if she wanted to make sure that this time she had no chance of surviving. When I finally managed to call 911, the paramedics arrived quickly, but it was clear there was nothing they could do. The house was quiet, eerily quiet. There were no more fights, no more crying, no more anything. It was just me, alone with the ghosts of my family, with the echoes of everything that had gone wrong. I don't know what's next for me, Reddit. I don't know if I'll ever be able to move on from this, or if I even deserve to. But I guess for now, All I can do is keep going, one day at a time, and hope that maybe, somehow, I'll find a way to keep living in a world that took everything from me. So that's it. That is the story. There's no happy ending, no silver lining, just the reality of what happens when life breaks you in ways you never thought possible.